I am a platypus. You are probably wondering how it is I can speak without moving my face. Well, I am from the future, and we can communicate telepathically. We no longer have need of speech, as you primitive people from the past relied upon. How is it, you probably also wonder? I can speak English. Well, as you know, platypuses are evolutionary marvels, and in the distant past, we mated with humans, and our genes, being the more dominant, took over, and so now all of you look like us. Now, without anything more, let's talk about Chapter 12 of Invisible Man. In Chapter 12, several important things happen, so please pay attention. It will help you in your future. First, the narrator makes his way back to Harlem, but as a newborn, he is feeling weak and faints on the streets. He is taken in by this kindly woman named Mary. Then, after he recovers, he goes back to the men's house, where, in a moment of mistaken identity, he sees a man who looks from the rear like Bledsoe. And so, in his anger, he dumps a bedpan full of poo and pee on the preacher's head. You'll remember such a scene from Candide. We'll talk about that later. Well, having worn out his welcome at the men's house, he moves back in with Mary. And then months pass. Let's talk about the structure of this chapter. Note that it is a short chapter between longer chapters. Take advantage of the fact that it's a short chapter and read ahead into tomorrow's chapter. Chapter 13 is long. In addition to it being a short chapter, we get a long dialogue. We hear a lot of Mary's voice in italics. We don't normally get such long speeches. It is interesting because it is so rare. More, he finds a new home. This is a book of transitions from phase to phase, from place to place, and now he is in a new home with a woman mother figure, very new for him. And as the chapter ends, he tells us he is primed to return to making speeches. So, you can anticipate in chapter 13, there will be speeches. We'll get to that tomorrow. Let's talk about some of the style in this chapter. First, as I've already mentioned, telepathically, there is some newborn imagery. Further underscoring that, there is some mother imagery. It is no coincidence that the mother's name, or the mother figure's name, is Mary, the archetypal mother from the Bible. Also, it is too much to say, even though Allison is known for literary and linguistic excess, that he is a stranger to understatement. In fact, he uses understatement on page 257 when describing or not describing explicitly what he's doing with the bedpan and dumping it on the preacher's head. Notice also that the porter refers to it as a crazy baptism, a kind of perversion or subversion of that religious rite. Also, somewhat ambiguously or ominously, there is a lot of ice imagery. So, pay attention to that. A lot of talk about ice and freezing, used in a variety of ways. What does it all add up to? We'll have to figure that out. Also, on page 259, he refers to Lord Kelvin. If you recall from taking physics as freshmen, Kelvin was a physicist who did something with temperatures, if I recall correctly. But what is really interesting is that Allison feels the need to name drop, or at least have the narrator name drop someone important, that only educated people would know, just as he used the word palaver in the previous chapter. We've noticed this about Allison from his introduction, where he himself likes to use a lot of famous people to describe his state of mind, his influences. There's a lot of self-consciousness going on in that. We've talked about that before. Finally, on page 260, the narrator talks about this irrepressible voice that he is feeling. This desire to break out. It is interesting, this irrepressible voice, because Allison himself talks about an irrepressible voice when he was first contemplating writing this novel, and the voice of the narrator speaking in the prologue kept interrupting his other thoughts. And so here, Allison is having the narrator talk about the very experience that he himself had. Finally, let's talk about some themes. Let's talk about them in terms of duality, since this chapter is filled with conflicts, cognitive dissonance, feelings of being torn. So, one such duality is interdependence versus solitariness. Mary says, you gotta depend on each other, but the narrator feels a need to be on his own. Also, the notion of responsibility for others, especially your own race, versus a desire to take care of yourself and be self-sufficient. Finally, the duality between dreams versus disillusionment. A lot of discussion of that, especially with the characters in Men's House. And so that's a lot of what's going on in chapter 12. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the longer chapter 13. Since this chapter was a short one, you can expect a lot going on. One other thing to expect. We've seen a lot in the first half of the book. A lot of crazy things happening. Oh, am I talking down? Sorry about that. A lot of crazy things happening. Well, you know already, Allison is a master at pacing and having extraordinary events top one another, each event being more exciting than the one that preceded it. Well, if a lot of exciting things happen in the first half of the book, you can expect even more exciting things in the second half of the book. So, strap in, kids, 'cause here we go!